Our next guest on With the Greatest Respect is Sir Rod Eddington. Sir Rod Eddington is one of the most accomplished Australian businessmen with a career in aviation spanning decades. During the podcast, we cover some of Rod's philosophies across business, sport, and also politics, as well as his non-executive life with Rupert Murdoch's News Limited. Sir Rod Eddington is one of the great Australians, and I'm sure you'll enjoy this podcast on Rod Eddington. Good morning, Rod.
Morning, David. Morning.
This is so good of you to do this, and I'm not sure whether you've done much of this before, but the opportunity to talk to you about your life is one of privilege, so I appreciate it. And
thanks.
I'm going to start right at the end, actually, and just ask you a question about how you feel about your career from someone who's admired you for many, many years, looking back on your life as a life of extraordinary achievement so far, and the breadth of your coverage around media, sport, government, brewing, aviation. There's just such a big breadth of coverage that you've had in your career. How do you think about your career in your early 70s?
Well, I've always been curious, so the chance to embrace new opportunities has always appealed to me. But the core of my business life was around aviation. And I was really lucky when I finished at university. I joined the Swire Group, a British entity based in Asia, had been in Asia when I joined them for over 120 years. And I learnt a lot in my time working for them, and I'm still on one of their boards. So, yeah, I look back and think I've had some wonderful opportunities, not just through work but through education, and it's about learning along the way.
And if I can go to education, because that's such a big part of your life, and growing up in Perth, can you tell us a bit about your parents and the decisions that were made as far as your education leading to what obviously was the pinnacle, being your time at Oxford?
Well, I was born in Perth. Mum and Dad lived in Perth. My father worked for the Commonwealth Bank, being a pilot during the Second World War, and it's one of the areas that gave me a love of aviation. But when I was little, we were transferred to the bush. Dad worked for the Commonwealth Bank in Katanning, Bunbury and Mandurah, all country towns. And so all my primary school days were in the bush, and I loved every minute of that. In fact, when I finished primary school, there was no high school in the town we lived in then, Mandurah. So I came to Perth to go to secondary school effectively. And my years in the bush taught me an awful lot.
And you boarded at Christchurch School?
I was going to, but my father was fortunately transferred to Perth itself. So in 1963, when I started at Christchurch Grammar School, where I did my secondary schooling, he actually and the family had moved to Perth, so I was fortunate I didn't board through that period.
So, Rod, as you were going through those formative years, what were your ambitions, and who were the people you were looking up to at that stage? And as you started to dream about the life going forward, what were some of those dreams, and who were some of the people that you looked up to?
Well, Mum and Dad, obviously. Your parents are fundamental, I think, to shaping who you are. I had some great teachers, and living in the bush teaches you some self-reliance and also some resilience. One of the things I always respect in people is resilience, the ability to cope with the slings and arrows of misfortune as well as the opportunities. And living in the bush taught me that. I think, David, too, the other thing it taught me, my father was a keen baseballer and cricketer. And wherever we went in the bush, he immediately had a group of friends who he played cricket and baseball with. So team sport became a really important part of my life. And I got that from my father, really, and from realising that when you go to a new place, if you've got something in common with them, and sport's a great universal language, it makes a big difference. So I think I was shaped by that in some important ways.
And you played grade cricket, didn't you, before you went to Oxford?
Yes.
Was cricket, was it something that you thought you could progress after university?
So I played cricket and football at school and at university, Australian rules football. So I played cricket and football for the university and loved every minute of it. I think the great thing about sport, David, is you get direct feedback at the end of every session. It's called the scoreboard.
Yeah.
You look at the scoreboard and then you look at your own stats and your role, be it significant or insignificant in that. So it's one of the great things about sport. There's no ducking that reality. And I realised that as important as sport was to me, and as much as I enjoyed playing, I didn't have the capacity to play at the absolute elite level. And that was one of the good things about playing grade cricket, for instance. You played on Saturday and Sunday with men who were current test players.
And who are some of those? So John Inverarity, I know you were very close to.
John Inverarity, Rod Marsh, both played in the side I played in at university. But you played against people like Graham McKenzie, Ross Edwards, Kim Hughes, Bruce Laird.
Play against Dennis Lilly?
Yes, played against Dennis, who I have the greatest respect for. Facing him wasn't much fun, but he's a wonderful human being and a great competitor. So you played against the best, and that gave you a chance to assess your own capacity and ability. And I loved playing sport in that environment. But there were other paths for me to walk down, and I chose those. And one of the reasons was, as much as I loved my sport, I realised it would be a hobby, not a profession.
Yeah. So you study at university in WA. You then get the opportunity to go to Oxford, a Rhodes Scholarship. Can you talk about how that happened and the profound effect that had on your life?
Well, it changed my life because I was effectively taken out of Western Australia, where I'd been born and grown up, and taken literally to the other side of the world. My father enjoyed his time in the Air Force in the UK. I think he was quietly someone who admired the English, the Brits, except when the Ashes series was on, when his preferences were clear. He was an Aussie supporter. So I'd grown up in a household which thought the opportunity to travel was something you should take, and I was lucky enough to get it. And Oxford did change my life, in part because it exposed me to an extraordinary, talented group of people, men and women of all shapes, sizes and descriptions, and all academic disciplines. And I found myself in the middle of a place that had been educating students for 700 years, and was a great place to learn and understand the world.
And your curiosity, which you referenced earlier, that must have also triggered this appetite to learn, and you know, having conversations with you over the years, and your knowledge of years gone by, history, is extraordinary. Did you get that from Oxford, or is that something that's developed over years where you've become so well read as you are?
Well, I think I'd always been curious, which I think is the beginning of understanding the world. But at Oxford, I found myself sitting around the table and listening to men and women who had done remarkable things. And some of them would speak about them in a entirely matter-of-fact way. There was no ego involved. So I was a graduate student at Lincoln College at Oxford, where Howard Florey, who'd developed penicillin during the Second World War, had worked. He was a Rhodes Scholar from South Australia who was there. And some of the young men he'd worked with were still teaching at Oxford and at Lincoln when I was there. So just the chance to sit and listen to them talk about the development of penicillin was an extraordinary opportunity. One of them, Norman Heatley, who lived for many years beyond penicillin, I remember asking him what their goal was, and clearly penicillin was a wonder drug, well, the wonder drug probably of the 20th century. And he said the goal for us was to have enough penicillin so that when the Allies ultimately invaded continental Europe, D-Day, they had enough penicillin to treat the wounded and injured. Now, as goals go, that is extraordinarily large. And it just helped me understand the way that people like Norman thought about the world and what they could do.
So you graduate from Oxford, you make the decision to go into the business world. Those formative years, and I'm probably now going to move into your career in aviation. Can you talk about your love affair with aviation? And obviously it stemmed from your father. Can you also talk about some of the other reasons why aviation fascinated you so much?
Well, I got lucky. I joined the Swire Group out of Oxford, and they, amongst other things, were the major shareholder in Cathay Pacific. They were and are a terrific family business, many generations in, gun barrel straight, really good at what they do. And I've always respected them and still do.
Based out of Hong Kong?
But a British company with its heart in Hong Kong. Strong presence in Asia. Opened their office in Japan in 1870 in Yokohama. had strong. They were originally a company that traded the China coast. They were shipping and trading people in the 19th century. So I joined them, and they were the majority owner of Cathay. I arrived at Cathay about the same time the first 747 arrived, which really sparked Cathay's global ambitions, because once they had the 747 in the fleet, they were able to fly to London, to North America. Prior to that, they'd been a regional airline, a very successful one, reasonably small, and it gave me an opportunity not only to understand a new business and learn, but also to understand Asia. As a university student in Western Australia, quite a few of my engineering fellow students were from Asia, primarily Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, a few from Hong Kong. So I'd begun to get something of a feel for Asia, and I had always thought that Australia's long-term prospects would be tied to Asia. So the chance to work for the Swire Group, who owned an airline and were based in Asia, seemed to me to be the sort of jump you could make into business. I didn't know whether it would like me, business would like me, and I'd like it, but I was very keen to give it a go, and I got lucky. I joined the Swire Group and went to Hong Kong.
And Rob, was Hong Kong the hub it became then, or did it develop through your time there?
Well, it certainly developed, but it was already recognised as one of the key Asian hubs, in part because it had the rule of law, it had a competent administration, it was geographically well placed. It turns out that being on the China coast at that time, just as China was about to take off as an economic entity, was a great place to be. And it had the infrastructure that really great hubs need. Schools, hospitals, transport systems, all the things that are necessary. And for me, Hong Kong and Singapore were the two key Asian hubs through my time working in Asia.
And there's a really interesting question amongst that, because what's going on in the world today, particularly in that region, is pretty complicated and pretty tenuous as well. What's your take on China, the relationship with Hong Kong, Taiwan? How do you see that evolving over the coming months, but also years?
Well, it's a good question, and I don't think anyone really knows the answer. I mean, my first observation would be that Hong Kong is now sovereign Chinese territory. In my time, it was a British colony with strong China links, and it's after 1997, it's sovereign Chinese territory, and under the one country, two systems mandate, it has some considerable autonomy, but nevertheless, it's sovereign Chinese territory. I mean, my first observation, David, would be that no one's ever made money betting against Hong Kong. So I don't think you can write Hong Kong off just because of the challenges it faces at the moment. And it has the great advantage that it is part of China, because the China opportunity for many companies, including many Australian companies, is very real. I think for me the challenge is this, that as China becomes a dominant economic force, it's now the second biggest economy. I mean, one day it'll be the biggest economy on the planet. What does that mean for its ambitions in political and influence circles? And I think we've got to understand that and find ways to work with all the good elements of that. It's Australia's major trading partner and has been for some time and will continue to be. And for the first time since European settlement here in Australia, our major trading partner is not also a strategic partner. So if you go back to European settlement, Britain was our major trading partner and a strategic partner, as America became and as Japan became until the rise of China. So we now have a challenge, which is it's our major trading partner, it's not a strategic partner. How do we deal with China and on what basis? And I think that's something that's going to challenge governments in both Australia and China for some time to come.
And Taiwan, how do you think that plays out in the short term?
Well, Taiwan is right on China's doorstep, but it's an extraordinary place. I spent a lot of time in Taiwan in my Cathay Pacific days particularly. It's an extraordinary place with extraordinary people, entrepreneurial, and in my time it was very distant from China. Today a lot of Taiwanese businesses have strong presence on the ground in China, and I think the Chinese economy benefits from Taiwan's proximity and vice versa. So my view has always been that there will be a form of reconciliation between the two. But I think Taiwan is, in many ways, an entity that the world admires, and they will want it to be able to determine its own journey in some important ways, albeit that it is effectively on the China coast and part of that economic entity.
Mm. And Rod, I want to say this up front: the role you played at Cathay and then recruited into the role of CEO of British Airways. It was one of the first Australian CEOs to make it big time on the world stage. Can you tell me how the recruitment process worked at BA, and also I want to ask about the excitement of taking on a role like that to probably one of the preeminent airlines the world has seen. And BA at the time was going through some fairly significant changes, which you came in and really turned it round. So can you talk about, one, the recruitment process, and then two, the role that you had to play at BA?
Well, the chairman at British Airways, when I joined them in 2000, a wonderful guy called Colin Marshall, Lord Marshall as he was then, had been CEO of British Airways when I was CEO of Cathay Pacific in the early 90s, and I admired enormously what Colin had done. I mean, Colin and John King, who was his chairman, effectively oversaw the transition of British Airways from a state-owned and run carrier into a very good, world-class private enterprise business and an airline to boot, and Colin had been terrific. So he was looking for a CEO in early 2000, and he called me and said, would I be interested? And it was a point in my journey where the opportunity really appealed, in part because I regarded British Airways as one of those world-class businesses, and it's not very often you get the chance to run a world-class business. By the way, I thought Cathay Pacific was too. And so I said yes. But the other thing was, and I spoke to my wife about it, we both thought the chance to live in England again, for me, her for the first time, and for our kids to spend some time there and go to school there would be a good thing. So in early 2000, I went across to London to do that. I think the thing about aviation, David, is it is buffeted by external events constantly of one form or another. So there's very rarely an easy time to be in aviation, but it was certainly true for me that was a difficult time. BA was going through some real challenges, as you say. But as always, when you go into a new business like that, you have to spend a bit of time getting a sense of the new business you're in. So one of the things I didn't do, which was to assume, because I'd been at Cathay Pacific and Ansett, that a particular problem at either of those airlines, when I saw the same problem at BA, the solution was the same, different time, different place, and therefore sometimes a different solution. So my sort of informal modus operandi was to go into a new business, whenever I've done that of one form or another, and simply to ask people, shareholders, frontline staff, managers, suppliers, customers, if you want to find out about an airline, speak to the customers, speak to Boeing or Rolls-Royce, who make aeroplanes and engines for most airlines in the world, because they'll be able to give you some insights about your new business that you mightn't necessarily have yourself. And always ask them the same questions, which is, what do you like about what we do? What don't you like about what we do? What do you think is broken, and how would you fix it? Not what you think he thinks is broken and how would he fix it. What about you? And you get some great insights around the business. And quite a few of them come from frontline staff. I mean, one of the things I did in my Cathay Pacific days was to work at Kai Tak Airport for a couple of years. And if you want to know what customers think about your business, go ask to the people who check them in, or work in the cabin, or fly the aeroplanes, or load the bags, because they see literally thousands of customers every day. So I had to build up a picture of British Airways through their eyes as well as my own before I felt able to begin to change something, because sometimes your first instincts about change means that you end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yes.
And I was determined not to make that mistake.
And Rob, we'll get to 9/11 in a moment, but for our listener, I would love you to paint a picture as far as a day as a CEO of a major airline like Cathay and British Airways, and because it would seem that it all is so dynamic. How many planes would you have in the air at any given day of BA in your time?
Well, it would be hundreds.
Yeah, so
literally, we had 300 aeroplanes.
Can you talk about your day and the way that you operated from the chair of CEO, and give it insight into aviation and how you need to manage it?
Well, I've always been a morning person, so start early. I think a lot of people who make a success of what they do start early. So I'd be in the office reasonably early. And my own view was that in a business as complicated as an airline, where you've got operational issues, you've got technology issues, you've got literally millions of customers a month, you've got large staff across a whole range of areas, you needed to have in place really good people in the key positions, because you can't be everywhere all the time, and if you try to be, you just get killed by the detail. You have to understand the key details. And Swires and Cathay had helped me do that by moving me from job to job, from place to place, and that gave me an opportunity to really understand the industry from soup to nuts. And that was extremely helpful when I found myself in a senior position, because it meant I could understand the challenges our people faced and some of the issues they had to deal with, because in some cases I'd lived in their shoes earlier on. So for me, start early, be clear about, you never know what's going to happen through the day. I think there's an old military adage that says no plan survives contact with the enemy, which is true. So sometimes you'll go into work expecting a quiet day and it might be bad weather or a problem with technology. I mean, one of the things that any CEO hates to hear, David, is a call from the head of IT to say the system's down, right? Because so much of what businesses do today are driven by the systems, the IT systems that run them. So you have to have the confidence that you have people in the key positions, including at the front line, especially at the front line, who can deal with whatever comes their way. And so for me, it was about, as a CEO, understanding the challenges the business faced, understand the pressures our people faced, and working to help them resolve them in a sensible way. But also to make sure your people have the equipment, the training, the skills, the technology they need to do their jobs well. And my own experience, particularly in the customer service business, if people are proud to deliver the product, then they will go to great lengths to make sure the customer gets a terrific experience. So you want them to be, in aviation terms, really happy with the seats, the food, the aeroplane should leave on time. People who drive the business day to day have to be proud of the product they deliver. And if they are, they'll go to great lengths to adjust when things go wrong. Because they do go wrong in any business, particularly in aviation.
There's some gold lessons in there. So, Rod, let me take you to 9/11. Can you remember the day? And,
oh, yes.
So it's probably, early afternoon in London?
Yes, it is. It's early afternoon in London. London's 5 hours ahead of New
So
York.
you're sitting at your desk?
Yes.
You get a phone call?
I do, from Ops Control to say that an aeroplane has flown into one of the Twin Tower buildings. My first initial reaction was that it was probably a light aeroplane that got lost. I think in the 1930s, 20s or 30s, a small aeroplane, I think it may have been a military aeroplane, flew into, I think, the Empire State Building in the fog in New York, because it gets very foggy. So my first instinct was, that's happened again. I very quickly discovered that wasn't true. And we had an emergency and accident centre at BA. And when we realised what had happened, that was activated, and then the second aeroplane flew in to the second of the Twin Towers, and then a third and a fourth aeroplane, one into the Pentagon and one that crashed in the woods. And so your first concern is, what is going on? And immediately afterwards, what does it mean for the business I'm in and the people in our business? Because we had something like 50 flights a day across the Atlantic to 20 plus destinations in North America, including 3 in Canada. So your next thought is, are any of those aeroplanes at risk? Then the Americans closed the airspace, and they said to any aeroplane that was in US airspace, land at the nearest available airport, don't press on to your destination. And to any aeroplane that wasn't in US airspace, you can't come into US airspace. Now that meant a significant number of aeroplanes, including some British Airways aeroplanes, that were on their way to the US, and the flight path from the UK to the US takes you over Canada, had to land in Canada. And many of them landed at airports in Canada, small airports, that had never seen anything like a 747, let alone 30 or 40 of them, parked on the taxiway of a single runway, because that's where they ended up, in Gander, in Halifax, in Goose Bay. And these are, in some cases, small communities, and you may have only had 2 sets of steps to unload 50 aeroplanes, and you certainly don't have any hotel rooms. And what about the cats and dogs in the forward cargo hold? And you realise that there wasn't much you could do sitting in your office in London to help. So it was the ops people, and particularly the crews on those aeroplanes, who effectively took control of their destiny. There were literally thousands of people put up in the living rooms of Canadians in these communities, because the US closed airspace for 4 days. So in many cases, these aeroplanes were trapped on the ground, and the people were trapped there for days. And it was just a remarkable example of what a group of men and women who take the initiative can do. And so for me, one of the many things I admired about the way the industry, but particularly British Airways, handled that was what the men and women in the business did. Yeah. Because they realised you couldn't call head office and ask for help. I mean, we couldn't send them cut lunch and sandwiches. They had to deal with it, and they did a brilliant job.
And Rod, could you ever have imagined that an aeroplane like that could be turned into a weapon like it was? Would that have ever crossed your mind?
No, it hadn't, because it had never occurred to us that terrorists would use commercial aeroplanes as weapons. You know, hijacking of aeroplanes had happened before, you know, through the 70s, where a terrorist would get on board and effectively instruct the crew to land at a particular destination, often because of some sort of ransom demand. But we never anticipated that what happened at 9/11 would happen, and in the way in which it happened. So back to that military adage, no plan survives contact with the enemy. One of the things that airlines do a lot of, David, is that they practice emergency and accident drills. But usually it's an aeroplane crashing somewhere or being hijacked and taken somewhere. There was nothing to prepare us for what happened at 9/11. As I said earlier, no plan survives contact with the enemy. But because I think you plan for different scenarios, you're able to quite quickly adjust what is happening and deal with it and cope with it. But it changed the way in which global aviation was viewed and is still viewed today.
That was fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. So as your time, as you go through this role at British Airways, which you, on all measures, did a wonderful job, you came in contact with some really interesting people. Can you talk about some of those characters, and maybe start with the royal family, because you had contact with the Queen and Prince Philip? What was your relationship with the royal family, and what can you tell us about them?
Well, British Airways would often carry members of the royal family, quite a broad range of royal family members, as they went about their official duties. And all my experience was that they were terrific to deal with. The Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, had a real love and understanding of aviation. He was a naval lieutenant during the Second World War and served in our part of the world here in Australia during that time. But after the war, learnt to fly, loved flying, really knew aviation pretty well, and was much respected by the people at British Airways, as was and is the Queen. So he would sometimes come if I had a building to open or a special event to celebrate. He would come and do that and do a brilliant job. And the people at British Airways loved having him in the buildings because he would engage with them and he knew what they were doing and valued it. And in a sense, the Queen, I think, Queen Elizabeth II has been one of the great leaders of the last century. I mean, this is her 70th year, Her Majesty's 70th year on the throne, which is a remarkable effort. I was there for the 50th celebration, and her sense of duty is extraordinary. And one of the things I think that's not realised by people for both the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh is their ability to put people at ease. And also the Queen's genuine love of Commonwealth and what the Commonwealth means. I just think there's a lot to learn in many ways, but including in the context of leadership, about the way in which the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh have gone about their lives. And of course, he sadly is no longer with us. But I admired enormously the way they went about their lives and the way in which they dealt with people, including many of the people in British Airways, me amongst them, and the affection in which they were held as a result.
Fascinating. And Rod, is aviation a good business?
So aviation's is a strange cat, David, because it is a business. It's an essential industry, but it is a business. But it's a business that in some parts of the world is still owned by governments. And businesses that are owned by governments don't always pursue commercial agendas. And that can make it very difficult for the genuinely commercial airlines, like British Airways, like Cathay Pacific, and like Ansett in my time there, because you're sometimes competing against state-owned operators who have a different agenda. Some of them are pretty good, by the way, but they have a different agenda. And that means your ability to generate a return for shareholders, for instance, can be compromised on occasions. That's just the reality. I think the other reality is increasingly airlines are becoming businesses. And I think British Airways is a good example. Until the early 80s, it was a state-owned and operated business. And Colin Marshall and John King turned it into a world-class business. And I think we've seen the same thing here at Qantas. I think Qantas, until the mid-90s, was a state-owned entity and it was privatised. Paul Keating's time as Prime Minister. And it's a very successful, very well-run business today. And I think there is no reason why taxpayers should be subsidising airlines, and that's what happens when they're government-owned. They should live or die based on their ability to operate in the private sector, and the good ones do.
I want to turn now to make the decision to come back to Australia. One of your sayings to me over the years has been always look to repot yourself after 6 or 7 years. Can you talk about that philosophy and how you've approached your different roles and explain the idea of repotting oneself?
Yeah, I mean, my view is that good people are like plants, David. They need repotting from time to time. You get root bound if you do the same thing for long enough. And good organisations do that to you anyway. So in my time in Cathay Pacific, and I was there for nearly 18 years, I worked in Hong Kong, I worked in Korea, I worked in Japan. I had operational roles, I had marketing and sales roles, I had HR roles, commercial roles. And so the company repotted me to give me a chance to grow and expand. And I think that's true of most of us. Some people take comfort from doing the same thing all the time, and often they do it extremely well. But I think for many of us, a chance to do something different, could well be with the same organisation, is something to embrace. And I thought that was true not only for me, but for my family. And I wanted my kids, who loved their time in the UK, to come and spend some time in Australia. My mother was getting towards the end of her journey, and I wanted to be back in Australia. I think that's one of the difficult things for Aussies who work overseas, is that you're away from friends and family. And I'd been away for a long time, basically, so I wanted to come home. And that was an opportunity to do it. I'd been at BA for 5.5 years at that stage. I took the view that we were back on very solid foundations. We had good people, a good board and good management team. So I had no qualms about saying time out. And we got back 3 weeks before my eldest child, our son, started high school. And I wanted him to have the chance to go to school here as well. So it was time. And it was repotting time for me.
And you met, or I presume you'd known Rupert Murdoch, but talk to me about the relationship you've had with Rupert Murdoch, and that has led to obviously a very long-standing relationship, and a relationship that's seen you on boards of News Limited. Can you talk about Rupert and the impact that he's had on your life?
Well, I first met Rupert in Hong Kong. When I was CEO of Cathay Pacific, he was owner of the South China Morning Post, and he would come through. He is, for me, the most extraordinary and outstanding Australian business leader of my time, without any doubt. He took a single newspaper in Adelaide and turned it into a business that is worth well over $100 billion US. And that is remarkable. News became News Corp. News Corp was split in 2013 into what we called 21st Century Fox and News Corp. Broadly along the electronic and print lines, it was a bit more complicated than that. And his capacity to understand the world, particularly the world of media, was remarkable. And having sat around his board table for many years and watched what he did and how he went about it, there's a lot to learn from that. One of the things is that he grew up, in a sense, editing a newspaper. And he learnt from the past, but he never spent too much time looking in the rear vision mirror. He never felt threatened by the transitions that took place into the electronic media world and what that meant. He never felt threatened by the chance. In fact, he grabbed the chance to work in the UK and the US as well as in Australia. And I just think he was, and still is in his early 90s, a most remarkable person and a great business leader. And his capacity to attract good executives and hold them, who often go on to do other things of real consequence. So people like Chase Carey, who's currently chairman of Formula One, here last week for the Grand Prix here. He was Rupert's deputy chair for many years, and he prior to that was COO. Peter Chernin, who probably understood more about the movie business than any. Some of the senior executives who are still there, like John Nayland, who's the CFO at Fox today. David Hill, who in many ways transformed the way in which live sports presented, and many others, found working for Rupert not only exciting, but provided them with opportunities that they may not have got elsewhere, simply because if you were good at what you did, he backed you. And he's an extraordinary man and a great business leader.
And Rod, his ability to reinvent the company, reinvent himself, because media is a landscape that's changed so much over his lifetime.
Yeah.
What are the skills that you see from him that has enabled him to look around corners effectively and see what's coming and do deals that, frankly, all of us scratch our head and say, how did he do that?
Well, I think he has deep understanding of the industry he's in. And I think that's the building block of any successful businessman or woman. They really understand the industry they're in. So their instincts are good and sound, and he's able to look at opportunity and see it through that lens and ask the right questions of his team about those opportunities. So he wouldn't pretend for a moment to do this by himself. He can draw good ideas from others, but he has a great instinct for opportunity himself. But the other thing is, I've never heard him say, we tried that 20 years ago and it didn't work, so let's not try it again. It may be an idea whose time has come. What he might say is, 20 years ago it didn't work for these reasons, so what do we need to do differently this time? There's a big difference between those two positions. So he'll learn from the past, but he won't be a prisoner of it. And I think there's a lot to be learnt in life from that. And the other thing is, he's devoted to what he does. He really respects people, and if you take the modern generation of leaders inside the business, Robert Thompson's a good example of that. Now, Robert is the current CEO of News Corporation. He's a Melbourne man. His wife Ping's terrific. He met her during his time in Asia. She's Chinese. They have two terrific sons. And Robert for me, is sort of slightly Rupert-like in the sense that he has a terrific vision of the world, doesn't feel threatened by it, treats people with respect. And that's something I've always seen Rupert do, treat people with respect. He has a reputation sometimes for being quite tough in business, but in my experience, he always plays the ball in those circumstances with the people who work for him. And so he's built a global business around really good people and his own ability to understand the industry he's in and not be threatened by a new opportunity. I can remember the first time we saw the iPad in a board meeting. It was very much in its early stages being developed by Apple. Now, you might think that for someone who'd grown up with printer's ink in his vein like Rupert, the iPad would be seen as a threat. Quite the opposite. He saw it as yet another way to get great content in front of customers, and that's typical of him.
Right, I'm going to change tack a bit now and talk about leadership and you've had a front row seat to some really interesting political leadership. Hawke, Keating, Blair. Can you talk about some of the politicians you've met and some of the people you've admired and if you want to go back in history as well, because I know you're a student of Churchill and things like that. Can you talk about political leadership, particularly heading into, obviously, an election here in Australia?
Well, I think leadership generally is a more complicated task, David, than it's ever been, because the world in which we live is a world full of opportunity, but it's also more complex. And leading in a complex world is, by its very nature, more complicated. I think the great political leaders that I've seen have demonstrated the values and skills of good leadership more broadly. You've talked about Hawke and Keating, who really changed the landscape here in Australia in some really important ways. I was overseas for most of that, but I was home on a regular basis and was able to watch from afar in many cases what they've done. John Howard, I'd put him in the same category. I think his period as Prime Minister was a very important part of Australia's own development, and he provided stability in some challenging times. Tony Blair in the UK did the same. You spoke about Churchill, but I'd seen other leaders. Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, I think, did an extraordinary job in the most difficult of circumstances when Singapore became independent in the mid-1960s. And I think if I can take an example, just one of many, one of the things that was said about John Howard as Prime Minister of Australia was that he would go down into the room where the politicians had lunch and get lunch and go and sit with a group of backbenchers and talk to them about the challenges they saw in their electorate and what they thought needed to be done differently. The ability to reach out across the spectrum. So he didn't just sit down and speak to his senior ministers. Of course, he spent a lot of time with them anyway. Foreign Minister Alexander Downer, the Treasurer Peter Costello, just as Hawke would have spent a lot of time with people like Paul Keating, his Treasurer, through a very important time. The ability to sort of reach out across the political spectrum, but also one of the things I think about political leadership is that if you get voted into office as Prime Minister, often it's quite a close-run thing, which means that the people who didn't vote for you, you're their Prime Minister too. And it seems to me that very good Prime Ministers manage for all of the electorate, not just for the people who voted for them, and understand the broader spectrum. And it often means that people who get elected in a close-run thing get re-elected much more easily. Closer to home, Steve Bracks here in Victoria became Premier in 1999. He only just got into office, and yet I thought he was a very good Premier, and when he stood for re-election some years later, he was comfortably elected to office. So I think when you put an individual in the chair, the leadership chair, their ability to exercise judgment across the piece, not just for those who voted for them, is fundamental to their longevity as political leaders. And the really great political leaders stay in office for some time, which allows them to deliver a broad agenda.
That's a great answer. And your view on leading the world today, which is pretty complicated with what's going on in Ukraine and what could happen in the South China Sea. Now with the US going into a period now where Biden is president, but Trump now looking to potentially rerun. What does that all look like for the world? Because it does seem like we're on the doorstep of a new world order.
Yes, and some of those things will play out in ways in which we expect, and some of them will play out in ways in which we don't, David. And you have to deal with both those realities. Closer to home, whoever wins the next election in Australia is going to have to deal with a large deficit that continues to grow.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it's not much different from us as individuals, you know. When you borrow, and governments that run up large debt are effectively borrowing, when you borrow, you have to repay. I mean, one of the things I've always said about me as an individual, when I borrow money from a bank, banks have got a nasty habit of wanting their money back at some stage. And you have to confront that and deal with it properly. And I think that's true broadly for governments as well. So, I mean, we entered a period in the mid to late 90s, beginning of the 21st century, Australia was effectively at federal level pretty much debt-free. And that gives you enormous resilience when things go wrong, because you can reach into the debt bag and pull funds to allow you to keep the show on the road. But if the debt burden is really high, you have a lot less flexibility. And I would argue that one of the reasons Australia survived the global financial crisis in 2009 in the way in which it did was that governments were able to borrow here in Australia. Interest rates were reasonably high. We had a strong economy. The Reserve Bank was able to push interest rates down, which gave business some breathing space. And we came through that period in pretty good shape. Now, commodity prices helped for some of that, but we came through it in pretty good shape. Whoever becomes the government of the day beyond the election here in Australia in 2022 is going to look at a different economic landscape. And if interest rates go up, they're going to have a lot less room to move and a lot less flexibility. And we need to recognise that, whoever wins the forthcoming federal election.
Yeah, the point you make about debt is a really good one. I'm going to pivot now to sport, and you love your sport. We've had lots of conversations over the years about particularly cricket. Who were your sporting heroes growing up, and who, if I had to say to you, here's a ticket price to go and watch any sportsman in the world, past or present, who would that be?
Well, cricket was important to me. So was Australian rules football. I grew up in WA and watched your father play, amongst other things. Centre half forward for West Perth, and a very good one. When I went to England, I played college rugby, which I loved, and then when I lived in Korea and Japan, I played rugby as well. So I've always loved team sports, because I think many of my best friendships came from playing team sports. Like-minded souls, you learn, as I said earlier, you get direct feedback playing sport, you can't duck it. And you have to live with victory and defeat, and as that Kipling saying goes, treat both of those imposters the same. But also, I think when you train really hard at a sport and you play in a team of people who have a similar commitment, that produces special bonds between the people you play with and against, to be frank. So for me, sport was a great opportunity to learn about the value of teamwork, also about giving it your best shot and not necessarily being successful. That builds resilience, and I think resilience, as I've said before, is really, really important. People's ability to cope with misfortune and opportunity hinges often on their resilience, and sport teaches you that. So I saw sport up close and still think it's really important. Now, in my case, it was sport. For others, it might be being in an orchestra or a choir, or being in the debating team, or the school play, or a play. So I think you can get those same sort of experiences through other activities, but in my case it was sport. As to the people, the people who had the most profound influence on me in a broad sense were people like John Inverarity, Rod Marsh, sadly no more, a chap called Peter Tannick, who was coach of the football team I played in at university in WA, Neil Donaldson, who was also a coach there. These are people, some of whom are well known, some of whom aren't, but were coaches and helped shape me and the way I think about the world. And I'm always been grateful to them. As to the question of, you know, like a lot of young Australians, I mean, when you grow up in the bush, Test cricket in England is about sitting around the kitchen table later at night than you might normally be allowed to stay up, listening to an Ashes game with your father, you know, listening to, you know, Graham McKenzie and Alan Davidson batting at Old Trafford and scoring enough runs for the last wicket partnership to allow Richie Benaud to bowl the English out to win the game. You know, I have those memories loud and clear. As to the athletes, I love watching great athletes. I have to say I'm not a great spectator.
Yeah.
But I love watching great athletes go about their craft because great athletes often appear, particularly in contact sports, to have time that others don't. The ability to move in space. And you know, I watch, you know, I'm a Fremantle Dockers fan, as you know, but when I watch someone like Scott Pendlebury playing for Collingwood, you know, his basketball training has given him the skill to find space where others can't. So I enjoy watching great athletes go around what they do. Michael Jordan, the US basketball player, wonderful athlete. I don't know how many times I've watched the replay of Herb Elliott winning the 1500 metres in Rome.
What a moment that was.
Yeah, what a moment when he beat Michel Jarzy of France by 30 metres, you know. What 3:35.6. What an extraordinary or Dawn Fraser winning the gold medal in the women's 100 metres freestyle in Tokyo in 64, the third time she'd done it, having done it in Melbourne in 56 and Rome in 60. I mean, there are moments like that that will stay you forever. But, you know, I enjoyed watching my kids play sport.
Rod, last couple of questions, and thank you for the time you've given me. Have there been any regrets, and if there are, what have you learned from things that haven't gone your way in a business career?
No regrets. You sometimes make mistakes in business and you have to learn from them. The trick is to make sure they're not life-threatening for you or for others. And sometimes you'll take a business decision that turns out to be a cul-de-sac rather than a broad highway forward. And you have to recognise that and be prepared to do a U-turn and start again. And that happens to all of us, I think. I think the trick is, in business and in life, is to learn from the mistakes of others as well. So, you know, one of the things I've done is always watched other business men and women make decisions. And sometimes they are the right decisions for the moment, but they turn out with the gift of hindsight not to have been right. And you watch how they cope with those realities and how they deal with it. So I think you learn from your own mistakes. You learn from the mistakes of those close to you, but you can also learn from the mistakes of others in different industries, in different walks of life, in different parts of the world. And that's about being curious. That's about taking good ideas wherever you find them. And sometimes you find them in unlikely places, but also learning from the mistakes of others. And if you do that, then generally you'll move forward.
So my last question, and it's the one I give to everybody at this stage of the interview. If you had to give a piece of advice to the 15-year-old Rod Eddington, looking back, what would that be?
It's always been about go for it, give it your best shot. You won't always win, but give it your best shot. The other piece of advice, I think, David, is I don't think there's any shortcut to any place worth going to. So don't think you can ever achieve success in any activity without really putting your shoulder to the wheel.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's very, very rare for people to move effortlessly into a successful position. Sometimes great leaders, great athletes look effortless in what they do and how they do it. But invariably, it's on the back of extraordinary commitment, hard graft, training, the lot. So one of the things I think I learned early on is that there is no shortcut to any place worth going to. And you have to remember that. I think the other thing I would say, which I think is true for me at the end of my career, is something that Rick Charlesworth said to me. Now, Rick was a great athlete, a doctor, a politician, but a great athlete. Very good cricketer, by the way, as well as almost certainly Australia's greatest ever hockey player and certainly our greatest coach. Coached the Australian women's team to golds in 96 in Atlanta and 2000 in Sydney, and the men's team after that to world championships. And a really great thinker, and has written extensively on the subject of coaching. And he once said to me, the role of a great coach is to comfort the troubled and trouble the comfortable. Now, what I like about that is it says, if you are successful and you get comfortable, you fail. Because your competitors don't rest on their laurels. They're not going to see you as a successful organisation that's standing still and think they can't overtake you, because they know they can. If they continue to evolve, get better, improve, do things a bit differently and move forward, and you get comfortable and stay put, you will ultimately be overtaken by your competitors. So one of the things I've learnt is never rest on your laurels, never get comfortable, and I think great coaches do trouble the comfortable.
Well, Sir Rod, it's a wonderful hour spent, and there's some really profound stuff there for our listeners, and I really appreciate. Thank you personally for being a great mentor of mine and an even better friend. So thanks for your time.
Thanks, David. It's been good fun.